What's up, guys? First of all, how big is that TV? Look at it. That's enormous. That's ridiculous. Who needs a TV that big? Mind you, I love it. Some of you will remember that when Renault initially unveiled their Cars of the World, I decided not to review it on the grounds that it was a digital render of the car, didn't look like the real thing, looked like a mock-up from last year's car. I was going to do the Renault car, review that, but I've actually decided not to. To me, it just does not look like that is the car that we will see when we come. Anyway, turned out that was indeed the case, and now we do have the actual Renault RS18, obviously having run around the racetrack in Barcelona last week. Now, this is definitely an evolution of the previous car, nothing too groundbreaking on this. Couple of little details visible on this particular picture. First of all, they've got a slightly narrower nose by the look of it than last year. There's a bit of detail around here, a little bit like the McLaren, with vented slots in the front wing hangers hanging off the nose there, allowing airflow to pass through those and channel it through the centre of the underside of the car, feeding out through the turning vanes and barge boards, as some of the other teams, or most of the other teams, have done. This idea, which McLaren started last year with the slotted front wing slots, that Ferrari have also taken on board this year as well, is becoming an increasingly popular solution. There's a little vent, what looks like the entry to an S-duct on the side of the chassis here, a little bit like Mercedes had, like McLaren had previously as well. Instead of taking the air for their S-duct underneath the nose, it looks like they're taking it from a little slot mounted on the side. You can see along here two little vanes or little raised sections along the top side of the chassis. Just little guide vanes for the aero, and particularly important this year because of the halo. Edge outside tip of the floor, just a little flick up, almost like a turned piece of the carbon fibre floor. And it's really there, as long with the tyre squirt slots that you can't really see too well on this particular picture, but just to direct the airflow around that rear tyre. I said this once before, but the rear tyres, all four tyres in fact, are a really unaerodynamic piece of a Formula One car. Obviously they're always rotating as well, which is an aerodynamicist's nightmare. They're big, fat, square frontal face. And they're always continually changing shape as they're going over the lumps and bumps. So a horrible device to have on a Formula One car from an aerodynamicist's point of view. So all of these little devices like this tyre squirt slots that we've seen before, like some of the little vanes and flick-ups we see on this part of the floor, is all about trying to divert the airflow around that tyre, just to get a cleaner flow around it, to keep the airflow sped up, so that we don't end up with a huge blockage from this tyre, which then spills out into these critical areas, particularly this side, in here towards the diffuser of the car. What you can see from this picture is the angle of the exhaust tailpipe. It's angled upwards. Now, the regulations limit the angle that you're allowed to have on that tailpipe. It's all because of the teams wanting to blow the exhaust onto the rear wing, to use the energized air coming out of that tailpipe to help blow onto those rear wings, onto the underside, and to keep the speed of that airflow up. Well, that's been limited, and so all the teams can do now is put a very small, very small, minute angle on that tailpipe. But even so, just that tiny angle will help some of that energized airflow, some of the exhaust gases coming out at high temperature and very high speed, of course, just direct some of them up towards the underside of the rear wing. And it just really helps to keep that efficiency of the rear wing upper plane. It's something that one or two teams have definitely done this year. More so, I think, than last year. Last year they didn't really need to because they had this monkey seat, as it was called, that very small wing that used to sit around the centre pylon section of the wing, just underneath in that gap between the upper main plane here and the exhaust tailpipe. That monkey seat has now been banned for 2018. And so any angle you can get on that tailpipe will just help to utilise the airflow coming out of the tailpipe to assist your rear wing. And it's quite clear that Renault have gone as far as I imagine as they can within the regulations on that. A great shot, this one. You can really see the detail around the side pod air intakes. And when I say the detail, there's not as much detail on this as we've seen on some of the other cars, is there? A much less intricate solution, I would say. Not to say that that's not going to work for them, but it's certainly not as detailed as some of the others. This is that vein that I was talking about before, that guide vein. Big channel, a big slot through there where the air will pass through. Any air that spills over and around the side of the intake just going to be picked up by that slot and directed off towards the back of the car. Similarly with this one, any airflow spilling over that top of that front edge of the side pod channeled its way down towards the back of the car there. That's a bit of gaffer tape, and all that's doing is hiding or guiding a wire or a piece of pipework that's probably sitting down in the bottom of the floor. As I say, either a sort of perhaps a temporary temperature sensor or a pressure tap. And these kind of, bit of tape, you might not think it's very Formula One, and it isn't very Formula One. You'd never see that, or highly unlikely to see that ever racing. But in testing, these cars are very rapidly evolving prototypes with every run almost. So these things are quick and easy fixes for stuff like that. You can see a very different shaped air intake, overhead air intake, than most of the other teams. Renault were leaning towards this shape last year as well, so not a huge departure for them, but they're definitely a different route to the way that all the other teams have gone. You can see that the top part of that is split, and there's also a split underneath with vents going in. So just going back to this picture, what I was talking about at the rear of the floor with a little turned out flick up almost at the edge of the floor section to turn the airflow around the rear tyres. You can clearly see on this picture how they're doing exactly the same thing with the front tyres. When I talk about the rear tyres being an aerodynamicist nightmare, they're nothing compared to the front tyres, because not only do you have the same problems of the shape and size and constantly evolving and changing shape of these tyres, the front tyres, of course, keep turning. And so it's not a fixed aerodynamic surface, which no matter what the surface is, if it's fixed in its position, an aerodynamicist can deal with it. A tyre is just a nightmare because it's rolling, it's turning, it's flexing, it's squashing, it's bouncing up and down. And so whatever they can do, this whole section of the wing, these cascades off the front outboard tips, and particularly these little flicks, outward flicks, are just trying to create an outwash. Fast outwash off the side of these front wings. That's what this split here is for as well, to allow the airflow to spill off the cascades and come around the outside of the car. This car, you can just about see here, has blown front wheel nuts, blown front axle. It's something that Renault had last year as well, so not new to them. But that blown front axle, which takes airflow in through the front brake ducts, passes it through a channel through the centre of the front upright and blows it essentially straight out of these open axles, open wheel nuts, sends a jet of air, flow of air coming straight out. So the airflow that's going in through the brake ducts is being diverted off inside that brake duct. Some of it's going to cooling the brakes, some of it is coming straight out of this axle. What that does, as that airflow exits out through the axle like that, in a controlled fashion, of course, very fast airflow in a controlled fashion, mixes with this outwash of the front wing and essentially tries to control it again, get it back under control. Having had this airflow that we've got coming through here under some form of control, and given that we know the speed, we know the shape of the exit that it's coming out of, it's going to spill out of here, connect with this outwash of the front wing and start to really form a channel that's going to come back around and wash around the back of the car again. Essentially just trying to tidy up this very messy area of airflow as it comes off here. Some of it is obviously inevitably going to hit the front tyre, spill out in all sorts of directions, and this jet, this outwash from the blown front axle is all about trying to gather that all together, try to clean it up, and send it on its way in a much more controlled fashion towards the rear. The suspension is much more conventional, as opposed to the system that Mercedes and others are now running with this outboard extension at the upright that the front top wishbone then mounts to. Some teams are running the top wishbone as high up as possible, connected up here to a sort of arm coming off the upright. Renault are much more conventional, a narrower gap between the two. This gold piece you can see here, that's the steering rack up high here. So the steering arm runs all the way along the front face of the top wishbone. That's obviously for aerodynamic reasons. It slides back and forward obviously as the steering wheel is turned, but it runs inside the same carbon fibre shroud that covers both the steering arm and the front top wishbone. It's just essentially one less piece to be in this, in disturbing the airflow, which is such a critical area, this airflow, and such a messy area, because the air that goes beyond this is the air that has to then be passed through the barge boards and the air intakes in the side pod and eventually makes its way to the rear of the car. On top of here, pitot tube, measuring air pressure, sticks out. Of course, you see them with all the bodywork on. That's what it looks like underneath. There'll be some pipe work running off here into a sensor box. This is the front push rod running up here onto a front rocker, which rocks up and down as the push rod moves up and down as the car goes over its bumps. And up here is the heave element of the suspension. Now this is the piece that was reasonably controversial last year, in that lots of teams had this heave element here interconnected through a system of hydraulic pipework to not only side to side in each corner, but also to another, its opposite number if you like, another heave element at the rear, which essentially was trying to constantly control ride height in a level and controlled platform for aerodynamic purposes. We used to call it FRIC, front rear interconnected suspension, and it got banned, if you remember, before the 2017 season started, and we thought it was going to heavily impact some teams more than others, and I think it probably did. Mercedes was certainly hit, I think, by that at the beginning of the year. Well, now front to rear interconnected suspension systems are banned, but the teams still use hydraulic systems like this in clever ways within the regulations to try and control as best they can a level ride height platform or a constant ride height platform to keep the aerodynamics as stable as they possibly can. And that is what you're looking at just here. I think there's lots of nice touches to this Renault, although I don't think it's revolutionary in any way. There's nothing that I've seen that is dramatically different either to its predecessor or really to the way that anyone else has gone. But look, the engine is the thing, or the power unit rather, is the thing that perhaps holds the most promise for Renault, perhaps the most potential for improvement. Even though they've been focusing largely on reliability, given the extra mileage that these units have to do in 2018, I still think there's a huge opportunity for growth within this team at Renault. They've employed a lot of people over the last few years. They've got two good drivers and managed to persuade Carlos Sainz, or persuade Red Bull to loan them Carlos Sainz alongside Nico Hülkenberg. Two great drivers, you've got to say. If they can get that power unit right, and this particular car is there or thereabouts, then this team is set to take a giant leap forward up the grid.